He never spoke more than necessary. For 15 years, Robert Chen had walked the halls of Lincoln High School with his cleaning cart, mopping floors, emptying trash, fixing broken desks. Students passed him like he was invisible. Teachers nodded politely but rarely engaged in conversation. To everyone at Lincoln High, he was just a quiet janitor who did his job and went home. What they didn't know was that the man cleaning their classrooms was a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient who had saved 23 soldiers in Vietnam. Robert Chun, 68 years old, arrived at Lincoln High every morning at 6 a.m., an hour before the first teachers. He preferred the silence of empty hallways, the methodical routine of preparing the school for another day. His blue work uniform was always clean, his graying hair neatly combed, his movements efficient and purposeful. There was something about his posture, straight-backed, alert, that suggested a different kind of training than custodial work. The students saw an old Asian man who spoke broken English and avoided eye contact. They had no idea they were looking at someone who had earned America's highest military honor for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Mister, Chen doesn't really talk much, Sarah Martinez, a junior, mentioned to her friend Ashley during lunch. I've been here 3 years, and I think I've heard him say maybe 10 words total. Ashley nodded, watching through the cafeteria window as Robert methodically swept the courtyard. My mom says he's been here since before I was born. Just does his job, minds his own business. What they couldn't see was a slight limp in his left leg from shrapnel that doctors never fully removed. The way his eyes constantly scanned surroundings, a habit from decades of situational awareness training. The precise, economical movements of someone who had learned to conserve energy for when it mattered most. At 3:15 p.m., when the final bell rang and chaos erupted as students rushed for buses and cars, Robert would begin his afternoon routine. Empty classrooms one by one, reset them for tomorrow. He had a system, developed over years of military precision applied to civilian work. In Mrs. Patterson's American History classroom, he always worked carefully around her extensive collection of military memorabilia, World War II posters, Civil War artifacts, Vietnam War photographs. She was one of the few teachers who made an effort to acknowledge him. Good afternoon, Mr. Chun. How are you today? Fine. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. She had tried, over the years, to engage him in longer conversations. There was something about his bearing that made her suspect he had military experience. But Robertson had learned long ago that some stories were better left untold. Mrs. Patterson didn't know that every time Robert cleaned around her Vietnam War display, he recognized places, faces, moments, that the photograph of soldiers crossing a river was taken less than a mile from where he had carried 3 wounded men to safety, that the medal displayed in her case was the same one he kept in a box at home, never worn, never displayed. The breakthrough came during Mrs. Patterson's annual Veterans Day project. She assigned her AP history students to research and present on American military heroes, encouraging them to find lesser-known stories of valor. Tommy Nguyen, a senior whose grandparents had immigrated from Vietnam, was struggling with his project. Most of the famous heroes had been researched countless times. He wanted something different, something personal. Mrs. Patterson, I'm having trouble finding a unique angle. Everyone's doing the obvious choices. Audie Murphy, John McCain, the usual suspects. Mrs. Patterson looked thoughtful. Tommy, sometimes the most extraordinary stories are found in the most ordinary places. What if you focus on Asian American veterans? There are remarkable stories that rarely get told. That afternoon, Tommy decided to start his research by talking to his grandparents about their memories of American soldiers in Vietnam. His grandmother, Lynn Nguyen, listened to his assignment and grew quiet. Tommy, there was an American soldier, very brave man. Chinese American, I think. He saved many Vietnamese people too, not just American soldiers. My cousin told me story many times. This soldier, he went back into fire many times to save people. Do you remember his name, grandmother? Chun something Chun. Very young man then, maybe 20 years old, but very brave. My cousin said this man, he could have escaped safe, but he kept going back. Saved maybe 20, 25 people. Tommy felt a chill. Chen wasn't a common name, but it wasn't unique either. Still, something made him pause. The next day at school, Tommy found himself paying closer attention to Mr. Chun, the janitor. He watched the way the older man moved, precise, alert, economical. The way he seemed to scan each room before entering. The small American flag patch on his uniform that Tommy had never noticed before. During lunch, Tommy approached Mrs. Patterson with a theory that seemed too coincidental to be real. Mrs. Patterson, this might sound crazy, but Mr. Chun, our janitor, do you think he could have military experience? Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow. What makes you ask that? My grandmother told me about an American soldier named Chun who saved a lot of people in Vietnam. And I've been watching Mr. Chun, and there's something about the way he carries himself. Mrs. Patterson had wondered the same thing for years. Tommy, that's a very interesting theory. But we need to be respectful about how we approach this. Military service, especially combat service, can be very personal. Tommy spent the next week researching Chinese American Medal of Honor recipients from the Vietnam War. The list was short, and when he found the name Robert Chun, his heart started racing. Master Sergeant Robert Chun, U.S. Army, Medal of Honor recipient. Citation, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The official citation was brief, but Tommy found more detailed accounts in military archives. On March 15, 1968, during a fierce firefight near the village of Unlock, Master Sergeant Chen's unit had been ambushed. When his platoon leader was killed and several men were wounded in an exposed position, Chen had single-handedly provided covering fire while evacuating casualties. But that wasn't the remarkable part. The remarkable part was what happened next. When the initial evacuation was complete, Chen learned that several Vietnamese civilians, including children, were trapped in a burning building caught in a crossfire. Against direct orders to withdraw, Chen had returned to the combat zone 6 separate times, each time carrying civilians to safety. In total, Robert Chen had saved 23 people that day, 16 American soldiers and 7 Vietnamese civilians. He had been wounded twice, but refused medical evacuation until everyone was safe. Tommy stared at the old military photograph accompanying the citation. Even 50 years younger, even in black and white, even partially obscured by a military helmet, the face was unmistakable. Their janitor was a Medal of Honor recipient. Tommy rushed to find Mrs. Patterson. Mrs. Patterson, you need to see this. He showed her the citation, the photograph, the documented proof. Mrs. Patterson read the citation twice, her eyes widening. Tommy, this is extraordinary. But we need to be very careful about how we handle this. Some veterans don't want their service publicized. There could be very personal reasons why Mr. Chen has chosen to keep this private. But Mrs. Patterson, this is incredible. He's a genuine American hero, and he's been here for 15 years and nobody knows. Which might be exactly how he wants it, Tommy. They agreed to approach Robert Chen carefully, respectfully, and privately. Mrs. Patterson would speak with him first, gauge his comfort level, and ask permission before Tommy proceeded with his project. The next afternoon, Mrs. Patterson waited until Robert had finished cleaning her classroom before approaching him. Mr. Chen, may I speak with you for a moment? Robert paused in his work, slightly wary. In 15 years, no teacher had ever asked for a private conversation. Of course, Mrs. Patterson. She chose her words carefully. Mr. Chun, one of my students is working on a Veterans Day project about Asian American military heroes. He came across some information about a Master Sergeant Robert Chun who served in Vietnam. I wanted to ask, is it possible that you... Robert's face went completely still. For a long moment, the only sound was the hallway clock ticking. Mrs. Patterson, why you ask this? Because if it's true, it would mean that for 15 years, we've had a genuine American hero working in our school and we never knew. And if that's the case, I think we failed to show you the respect you've earned. Robert sat down heavily in one of the student desks, suddenly looking much older than his 68 years. Mrs. Patterson, I came here to work, not to be remembered for something that happened 50 years ago. Mr. Chen, may I ask why? Most veterans, especially Medal of Honor recipients, are proud of their service. Robert was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, because I was different then. Young, angry, want to prove myself. Yes, I saved people that day, but I also killed people. War makes heroes and monsters sometimes in the same moment. When I came home, people called me hero, but I remembered faces of men I killed too. Vietnamese men, not much older than these students. Mrs. Patterson understood. Mr. Chen, survivors' guilt and moral injury are common among combat veterans. But what you did, saving all those lives, that was a choice. You chose to risk everything to save others. I chose to disobey orders. I chose to put civilians before military objectives. Some people called it heroic. Military called it heroic. But I always wondered if I was just trying to balance the scales. Mrs. Patterson pulled up a chair. Mr. Chun, I've taught American history for 25 years. I've studied war, heroism, moral complexity. What you did wasn't about balancing scales. It was about seeing human life as valuable regardless of nationality. That's not guilt, that's conscience. Robert looked around the classroom, at the desks where students sat every day, learning about history, without understanding that history was sitting right there with them. These students, they see old Janitor who barely speaks English. If they knew about Medal, about Vietnam, they would see me different. But I am same person. Medal doesn't change who I am now. Mr. Chun, with respect, I think you're wrong about one thing. You're not the same person you were in Vietnam. You're better. You've spent 50 years proving that heroism isn't just about one day of combat. It's about choosing every day to serve others quietly and with dignity. The conversation continued for another hour. By the end, Mrs. Patterson had convinced Robert to meet with Tom and Gwen, to share what he was comfortable sharing, and to allow his story to be told, not as glorification of war, but as an example of how people can choose to serve others throughout their entire lives. The meeting between Tommy and Robert took place on a quiet Saturday afternoon in Mrs. Patterson's classroom. Tommy arrived nervous, unsure of what to expect. Robert arrived early, sitting in his usual precise posture, hands folded. Mr. Chun, I want you to know that my grandmother remembers what American soldiers did for Vietnamese people. She told me there were soldiers who risked their lives for civilians, not just for other soldiers. When I read about what you did, what do you want to know, Tommy? I want to know how someone makes the choice to go back. 6 times. When you could have been safe. Robert was quiet for a moment. Tommy, your grandparents came from Vietnam? Yes, sir. They immigrated here in 1975. They know what war looks like. They know what it costs. When I was in that village, I saw children, families, people just trying to survive. I thought about my own family in America. I thought about what I would want someone to do if my family was trapped. But you were already wounded. You could have died. Tommy, that day I learned something important. Being brave isn't about not being afraid. Being brave is about being afraid and choosing to do right thing anyway. I was terrified every time I went back into that building. But those people would die if I didn't try. Tommy took notes, but more importantly, he listened. Over 2 hours, Robert shared not just the events of that day in Vietnam, but the years that followed, the difficult transition home, the jobs that didn't work out, the decision to find work where he could serve others without recognition. Why janitorial work, Mr. Chun? Because schools are important. Students are future. I may not teach classes, but I can make sure classrooms are clean, safe, ready for learning. I can serve next generation different way. As their conversation continued, Tommy began to understand that Robert's 15 years at Lincoln High weren't just a job. They were a continued mission. Every clean classroom, every repaired desk, every hallway mopped perfection was an act of service. When Tommy asked if he could present Robert's story to the class, Robert agreed with conditions. You can tell about medal about Vietnam, but you must also tell about why service continues. Hero is not just one day. Hero is choice you make every day. The presentation was scheduled for the Friday before Veterans Day. Mrs. Patterson had arranged for the entire school administration to attend, though she hadn't explained why. Tommy began his presentation by talking about Asian American military service, providing historical context. Then he narrowed his focus to Vietnam War heroes, specifically Medal of Honor recipients. Finally, he projected the official citation from Master Sergeant Robert Chen. The classroom was quiet as Tommy read the citation aloud. Then he clicked to the next slide, a recent photograph of Robert in his janitor's uniform, standing next to the historical photo from his military service. The silence was profound. Sarah Martinez, the student who had mentioned Robert's quietness weeks earlier, whispered, "Oh my God, that's Mr. Chen." Tommy continued his presentation, explaining not just what Robert had done in Vietnam, but what he had chosen to do afterward. How he had spent 50 years serving others quietly, without recognition, without seeking glory. Mr. Chen taught me that heroism isn't just about dramatic moments. It's about showing up every day, doing good work, treating people with dignity. For 15 years, he's been taking care of our school the same way he took care of those soldiers and civilians in Vietnam, with precision, dedication, and selfless service. When Tommy finished, Mrs. Patterson asked if anyone had questions. Ashley raised her hand. "Is Mr. Chen here? Can we meet him?" Mrs. Patterson smiled. "He's waiting outside. He wanted to hear your reactions first." When Robert entered the classroom, the students spontaneously stood up, not because a teacher told them to, but because they instinctively understood they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. Robert looked around the room at faces he had seen for years, students who had walked past him, barely acknowledging his existence. Now they were looking at him with something he hadn't seen before: recognition, respect, understanding. "You have questions for me?" he asked simply. A dozen hands shot up. For the next hour, Robert answered questions about Vietnam, about military service, about courage, about the decision to serve others quietly. But the question that seemed to affect him most came from Maria Santos, a sophomore. "Mr. Chen, why didn't you ever tell us? We could have learned so much from you." Robert considered the question carefully. "Maria, I think maybe you learn more by seeing service without knowing about service. You saw a man who comes to work every day, treats job with respect, takes care of place where you learn. That is lesson 2. Service doesn't always wear uniform. Service doesn't always have medal. Sometimes service just looks like showing up and doing good work." After the presentation, word spread quickly through Lincoln High. By Monday morning, the entire school knew they had a Medal of Honor recipient emptying their trash cans and mopping their floors. But the reaction wasn't what Robert had feared. Students didn't treat him like a celebrity. Instead, they treated him with the kind of quiet respect he had always shown others. They said good morning when they passed him in hallways. They made sure their classrooms were tidier, requiring less work to clean. They stopped to ask how he was doing, not because he was famous, but because they finally saw him as a person with a story worth knowing. The Lincoln High administration arranged a special Veterans Day assembly. They invited Robert to speak, but he declined. Instead, he asked if Tommy could speak about what he had learned from the project. Tommy's speech focused on the theme Robert had emphasized, that heroism isn't just about dramatic moments, but about daily choices to serve others with dignity and purpose. For 15 years, Mr. Chen has been showing us what real heroism looks like. It doesn't always make headlines. It doesn't always get recognition. Sometimes it just looks like an elderly man with a mop and bucket, making sure our school is clean and safe so we can focus on learning. After the assembly, something remarkable happened. The local newspaper ran a story about Robert. Then the regional news picked it up. Within a week, Lincoln High was receiving calls from around the country. Other schools wanted to know about their quiet hero. Veterans organizations wanted to honor Robert's service. historians wanting to record his story. But the attention that meant the most to Robert came from an unexpected source. Tommy's grandmother, Lynn Nguyen, asked to meet him. She arrived at the school on a Thursday afternoon, accompanied by Tommy and several other Vietnamese American family members. Mrs. Patterson arranged for them to meet in the library after school hours. When Lynn saw Robert, her eyes filled with tears. She spoke in Vietnamese first, then switched to English. My cousin was in that village. Unlock, March 1968. She told me about the American soldier who came back for Vietnamese families. She said he could have left us, but he didn't. She said he risked his life for people who were not his people. Robert listened, his own eyes growing moist. Your cousin, is she? She passed 10 years ago. But before she died, she told me to look for that soldier if I ever came to America. She said his name was Chen, and he was the bravest man she ever saw. She wanted to say thank you. Lynn reached into her purse and pulled out a small, weathered photograph. It showed a young Vietnamese woman holding a baby, standing next to what appeared to be an American military vehicle. This is my cousin and her son, the son you saved that day. He grew up, came to America in 1990. He is doctor now in California. He has 3 children. Because of you, Mr. Chen, my family continued. Robert stared at the photograph, recognizing the woman's face after 50 years. I remember her. She was carrying baby when building caught fire. She wouldn't leave until I convinced her baby would be safe. That baby is Dr. Nguyen now. He wanted me to give you this. Lynn handed Robert an envelope. Inside was a letter written in careful English, along with photographs of a family, a man in a doctor's coat with his wife and 3 children. The letter read, Dear Soldier Chen, I do not remember you, but my life exists because of your courage. My mother told me many times about the American soldier who carried me from fire. I became doctor because I wanted to save lives the way you saved mine. My children know your name. We have not forgotten. Thank you for giving me the chance to live, to serve others, to have family. Your courage echoes through generations. Robert read the letter 3 times before he could speak. When he finally looked up, the entire room was quiet. Mrs. Patterson, I think maybe you were right. Maybe service is about more than just doing job. Maybe when we serve others, we never know how far that service reaches. The story of Lincoln High's janitor heroes spread far beyond their small town. Robert received letters from veterans, from students at other schools, from people who had heard his story and been inspired to look differently at the service workers in their own lives. But the most meaningful recognition came from Lincoln High itself. The school board voted unanimously to rename the main hallway Chen Hall and installed a small plaque that read, In honor of Robert Chen, who taught us that heroism comes in many forms, and that true service often goes unrecognized. Robert asked for one modification to the plaque. The final version read, In honor of all who serve others quietly, who choose daily heroism over momentary glory, and who remind us that extraordinary people often live ordinary lives. 6 months later, Robert still arrives at Lincoln High at 6 a.m. every morning. He still mops floors, empties trash, and maintains the school with the same precision he's shown for 15 years. The only difference is that now, students and teachers see him clearly. They see a man who made an extraordinary choice 50 years ago and has spent every day since proving that heroism isn't about a single moment of courage. It's about a lifetime of choosing to serve others, regardless of recognition. Sometimes the greatest heroes are hiding in plain sight, wearing work uniforms instead of dress blues, carrying mops instead of medals, serving others quietly and asking for nothing in return except the dignity of honest work. Robert Chen's story reminds us to look beyond appearances, to recognize that the person cleaning your office, serving your food, or maintaining your building might have stories of courage and sacrifice that would humble and inspire you. True valor often goes untold not because it's unimportant, but because the people who possess it are more interested in continuing to serve than in being celebrated for past service. The next time you pass someone whose job seems invisible, remember Robert Chen. Remember that heroism doesn't always announce itself, and that the most important stories are often written not in headlines, but in the quiet dedication of people who choose every single day to make the world a little bit better through their service. We need to see our unsung heroes, especially the ones who prefer to work in silence. Because sometimes the greatest honor we can give someone isn't a medal or a ceremony. It's simply recognizing their humanity, their story, and their choice to keep serving long after the world has stopped watching.